She placed the shoes beside the door every evening with a quiet precision. Left one first, then the right, both angled just so, mirroring the way he used to leave them after coming home. There was comfort in the repetition, in the familiar shape they made together, like quotation marks bracketing silence. But by morning, something was always different. A shift so subtle it could be mistaken for accident. A slight turn inward, a heel nudged forward, the laces curled just enough to suggest movement. She told herself it was gravity, the uneven floor, or maybe even her own memory playing tricks. But the shoes kept shifting. Not once, not twice, but again and again. Each day, quiet, consistent, unexplained. They were not new shoes. The leather had long surrendered its shine. Fine cracks laced through the sides like dry riverbeds, and the soles had worn thin in the places where he used to lean most heavily when tired. One lace was shorter than the other, always had been, and yet he never changed it. She had offered to buy him another pair once, something softer, more supportive, but he had declined with a shrug and that familiar half-smile that implied the old pair still had places to go. They had outlived him now, but they remained, as if reluctant to accept their retirement, as if the journey had not truly ended. In the beginning, she thought little of it. Perhaps her foot had nudged them without realizing. Perhaps the cat, though the cat had never taken interest in things without scent or motion. And yet, the arrangement grew stranger. Sometimes they pointed toward the kitchen, other times toward the window. Never more than a few inches from where she'd placed them, but always different enough that she paused. She never caught the movement itself, only the results, only the feeling that some unfinished step was being rehearsed, night after night, in silence. She began testing them, marking the tile beneath with faint pencil lines, placing a small dish of flour just beside the heel, hoping to catch a scuff. Each time her traps remained untouched, but the shoes had moved, never far, never dramatic, just a tilt, a pivot, a posture that did not belong to the inanimate. She stopped trying to explain it, not because she had found an answer, but because some part of her began to believe the shoes were not asking for one. They weren't lost. They were continuing, slowly, quietly, as if the path they once knew had not disappeared, only faded, and they were determined to remember it, 1 inch at a time. There was a day she nearly picked them up, not to wear, not to clean, but simply to hold. Her hands hovered above them for a long moment, suspended in the quiet like something forgotten mid-prayer. She didn't know why the gesture felt so intrusive. They were just shoes. Worn leather, stitched fabric, rubber sole. But her fingers hesitated at the edge of their presence, as if they might recoil at her touch, as if lifting them would interrupt something invisible still in motion. She let her hands fall back to her sides and stepped away, feeling as though she had almost said something out loud without realizing it. They had not always been by the door. In the first week after the funeral, she kept them in the closet, tucked behind the vacuum cleaner and a rolled-up umbrella. Out of sight, out of reach. But they had a way of making themselves remembered, not by noise or scent or sudden movement, but through absence, through that distinct sensation of something missing from the room, a silence that pulled inward instead of stretching outward. She began noticing the empty space more than she ever noticed their presence when he was alive. That was what made her retrieve them, set them beside the door again, almost apologetically, as if acknowledging she had removed something that was not quite ready to be gone. Sometimes, in the late afternoon, she would sit on the bottom step of the staircase and look at them. No reason. Just the habit of it. The shoes became a kind of punctuation to her day. A period at the end of quiet hours. A small landmark in a house that had started to shift in tone and meaning. She would watch the light crawl toward them through the hallway window, reaching their tips by sundown. And each time she would wonder if they felt it too. The turning of the day, the slow folding of hours into silence. One evening, when the power went out, she lit a candle and sat near them. Not close, just near. The flickering light made them look almost animated. The shadow of the laces danced on the tile. The tips of the toes caught the orange glow like something breathing. She didn't speak. There was no need to. But in that stillness, in that pale half-light, she began to feel not that she was keeping watch over the shoes, but that the shoes were keeping watch over her, holding vigil not as relics of a man lost, but as companions of something that refused to be buried. A memory still walking, a presence still returning, one careful step at a time. There were mornings she pretended not to notice. She would walk past them, coffee in hand, gaze fixed ahead, deliberately ignoring the shift in their posture. It became a quiet game. If she did not acknowledge their movement, perhaps they would settle. Perhaps they would rest. But the truth was, the silence around them only grew more deliberate. The shoes were not demanding attention. They were simply being, existing in a way that felt both ordinary and uncanny, like rain falling indoors or clocks that skipped seconds. Nothing aggressive, nothing unkind, just a steady refusal to remain still. One morning, the left shoe was farther from the door than ever before, nearly 2 feet out, angled sharply toward the hallway. She stood there for a long while, longer than she meant to, staring at the space it had crossed. No wind had passed through. The windows had remained closed all night. She checked the floor, ran her fingers along the edge of the tile, half expecting to find some ridge or slope that might explain it. There was none. Only the flat, cold surface of a house that had no reason to lie. And the shoe, quietly resolute, facing forward as if waiting for her to follow. She slid it gently back to its place beside the right one, careful not to let the soles scrape the tile. Then she knelt beside them, resting her hand just above the worn leather, not quite touching. There was no heat, no pulse, no sign of life. But there was something, an echo perhaps, or a weightless impression, the way the air changes when a memory enters the room. She stayed there, still as the shoes once were, and for the first time, she wondered not where they were going, but what they might be trying to return from. That night, she dreamed of roads she didn't recognize, long, narrow paths winding through places she had never seen but somehow understood. The ground was soft beneath her feet, but she was not walking. She was following. 2 dark shapes just ahead, moving slowly, steadily, always a step beyond reach. She could not see who wore them, only the curve of motion, the rhythm of a walk she once knew. And when she woke, breath slow and eyes damp, the shoes were there, back in their usual place, untouched, but perfectly aligned, as if they too had needed the rest. She began to notice the absence of dust. The rest of the house carried it in layers, on picture frames, along the baseboards, even the unused corners of shelves where light rarely reached. But not here, not around the shoes. The floor near them stayed strangely clean, as if something unseen swept the space gently each night. It wasn't just lack of particles, it was a clarity, an emptiness that felt curated, like a stage reset between acts. She never wiped the tiles, not deliberately, but every morning the area gleamed faintly, as though the act of remembering had polished the ground beneath them. There was a rug near the threshold, old, faded, once burgundy but now somewhere between rust and shadow. He had tripped over it often, especially in his last years when his step grew uncertain. She had thought to roll it up after he passed, but couldn't. It was the last thing his foot had tangled with before they wheeled him out. A final stumble, a small curse under breath, and then the sound of silence rearranging itself around loss. The shoes never stepped on the rug, but lately she found them drifting closer to its edge, 1 inch at a time, like they remembered the misstep, or wanted to fix it. She placed a small glass of water on the floor beside them one night. Not for drinking, just offering. The gesture felt absurd as she did it, and yet not unnatural. In certain cultures, she recalled, people left food and water for spirits in transition. She didn't believe in such things. Or maybe she did now. Just enough. The water remained untouched the next morning, but clearer somehow, as if stirred by air rather than hand. She poured it down the sink without comment and placed another glass the following night. On the fifth day, she found the shoes not only moved, but facing each other, left and right, toe to toe, as if caught mid-conversation. She froze in the doorway, heart tightening, not in fear, but in recognition. That stance was familiar. That was how he'd leave them sometimes when he sat on the step to tie them. A kind of half-circle, intimate, reflexive. Not an accident, a ritual. Something the body did when it still remembered how to prepare for the day. She didn't move them back. Not this time. She left them as they were, the way she used to find them when mornings were still shared, and footsteps still echoed in pairs. Some days she tried to ignore the shoes altogether. She would walk faster past the doorway, distract herself with cleaning, open windows she normally kept closed, turn the radio on at a volume slightly louder than needed. But the shoes remained patient. They did not protest her distance. They waited, always within sight, never in the way, like a sentence unfinished at the end of a quiet page. And the more she tried to turn away, the more their stillness seemed to lean toward her, not pleading, not pulling, just existing in a way that refused to be forgotten. She once found a pebble inside the left shoe. Small, gray, smooth, the kind of stone picked up from a walking path rather than a driveway. She hadn't been outside much. She hadn't worn those shoes in over a year. The pebble shouldn't have been there. She placed it on the windowsill without a word. 2 days later, it was gone. She didn't search for it. Some things, she had learned, were better left as questions than answers. But in its place the next morning, she found the left shoe had a faint smear across its toe, like it had brushed against something damp, muddy, just enough to mark it, just enough to suggest contact with ground. Memories began to rearrange themselves, not the loud ones, the anniversaries, the hospital visits, the sound of machines, but the small ones, the feel of gravel underfoot on their last long walk, the way he used to stop and nudge stray stones from his shoes with the side of a bench, the fact that he never tied his laces tightly. She had forgotten these things until the shoes reminded her, not with photographs or mementos, but with gestures, with posture, with silent insistence. Grief, she realized, does not only echo through tears or silence, it travels by repetition, by the way objects lean, wait, and return to place. One night, while closing the curtains, she paused and looked down the hall. The shoes were there, same as always, but something about their shape seemed different. They looked expectant. Not in a magical way, not blinking or glowing or whispering, but with a quiet that felt like attention. She stood in the dusk-blue room for a while, unsure what she was expected to do. Nothing came. No revelation. Just the presence of shoes that had outlived their purpose but not their story. And a woman who began to suspect that maybe, just maybe, she was not the only one still waiting to go home. On the morning of the first rain in weeks, she awoke earlier than usual. The sky was still gray, the kind of color that settled over everything like dust. She moved through the house slowly, barefoot, her steps quiet on the wooden floorboards. Before the kettle, before the curtains, before the day had properly begun, she turned toward the hallway and saw the shoes, already wet, not soaked, just kissed by moisture, the way grass clings to bare ankles after a dawn walk. But the hallway was dry. The door had remained locked. There were no open windows, and yet the shoes glistened faintly in the half-light, as if they had just come back from somewhere only they could go. She didn't panic. She didn't cry. She simply stood still, letting the stillness return through her. The air felt different that morning, not heavy, not electric, just aware, like the house had breathed in deeply and was holding that breath, watching her. She approached slowly, knelt again beside the shoes, and this time, she touched them. Her fingertips grazed the damp leather, warm from nothing she could explain, and she whispered nothing. There was nothing to say, only a presence to meet, a moment to receive. And as she rested her hand atop the left shoe, she realized it no longer felt like a belonging. It felt like a message. She spent the rest of the morning with them, not cleaning, not rearranging, just sharing space. She opened the window near the stairs, let the rain air drift in, and watched how the drops painted the tile. She did not move the shoes from the wet. They seemed to welcome it, like something familiar had returned. She wondered if this was what he had waited for, a change in season, a scent in the air, a signal that it was time to continue, or perhaps to let go. By nightfall, the shoes had dried. Their color darkened slightly, the way things do when they've been touched by something real. She placed a soft cloth beneath them, not to contain them, but to honor the place they chose to rest. And when she turned off the light, she did not look back with worry or wonder, just with the quiet knowing that something had moved forward, not dramatically, not loudly, just one step closer to whatever end the shoes had remembered, and she had begun to understand. The next morning she found footprints, not real ones, not with treads or toes or pressure, but faint outlines in the dust leading away from the shoes. Just shadows, really. Changes in texture, swirls that interrupted the usual layer of quiet powder that clung to the hallway floor. They trailed off only a few feet before vanishing into the unmarked tile, but their shape was unmistakable. Left, right, left again. A stride too familiar to dismiss. Her breath caught as she bent closer, not from fear but recognition. She had once walked beside those steps, felt their rhythm in the sidewalk beneath her, timed her own pace to match his without thinking. It had been years since she remembered what that rhythm sounded like. Now the dust had remembered it for her. She didn't clean it, didn't wipe or sweep or even breathe too hard. She let the prints stay, even as they began to blur with the movement of her own feet. For a time she stepped around them, careful not to disturb their silent path. But eventually, it became impossible. Life moved forward, even in the smallness of her routines. And so, the prints faded naturally, not erased, but worn, folded into the rhythm of a house still being lived in. That, too, felt like a kind of permission. Later that week, she found the shoelaces undone, not just loose, but open, the way they used to fall when he kicked them off after a long walk. She hadn't touched them, hadn't moved them from the cloth where they now rested each night. But the laces curled outward like vines growing in remembered directions. She knelt down again, not to retie them, but to sit with them. There was something honest in their looseness, something that spoke of return, of being home, but not quite done. She left them that way for days. Even when the ends began to fray, even when dust began to gather in their threads, she did not reach for them. Some stories, she thought, are told more truthfully when left unfinished. She began to hear the house differently, not in sounds, but in textures. The creak of the stairwell lost its sharpness, softened into something slower. The refrigerator hum, once irritating, now felt like breath. Even the ticking of the old wall clock began to align itself with a rhythm she could almost hum along to. And always, there were the shoes, not loud, not center stage, just quietly present, always in motion when no one watched, always pausing when she turned her head, as though they were walking again, but not away from her, only ahead. One afternoon she moved the shoes to the back porch. It wasn't a decision, not exactly, more like a gesture that arrived without thought. The sun was soft that day, filtered through branches just beginning to brown. She placed them side by side near the railing where the wind occasionally carried the smell of earth and old wood. They didn't seem out of place there. In fact, they looked more themselves than ever, as if the open air helped them breathe again. She sat nearby, knitting something she wouldn't wear, and let the hours lean gently into one another. A bird landed near the left shoe, blinked twice, then hopped away. The shoes did not stir, but somehow they looked less still. Shadows passed across them as the clouds shifted above, and with each passing minute, she began to feel less like their keeper and more like their guest. There was a subtle dignity in the way they waited, no longer by the door, no longer confined to the threshold of return. They now faced outward, as if ready not just to remember, but to lead. That night, She dreamt of a road bordered by fences low enough to step over. There were no houses, no signs, just a horizon that refused to get closer. And in front of her, again, were the shoes, moving slowly, deliberately, never rushed. But this time, she wasn't chasing them. She walked behind with a quiet understanding, matching their pace, her steps cushioned by soft earth and the sound of something she couldn't name. It wasn't a sad dream. It was measured, like a memory being built in real time. She began to keep a small notebook near the porch. Not a journal. She didn't write in full sentences, just single words, sometimes symbols. East. Dust. 3 steps. Once, simply, here. It didn't mean anything in a linear sense, but it felt necessary, like she was charting something invisible only she could sense. She never reread the entries. They weren't for revisiting. They were anchors, glimpses, quiet affirmations that something was happening, even if no one would ever explain what. By the end of the week, she noticed the shoes had changed color. Not dramatically, just a shade deeper, as if dusk had soaked into them. The scuffs were still there, the creases still folded like memories in motion. But something about their presence had settled. They no longer felt like they were resisting stillness. They were embracing movement in place, like roots that had decided to grow not downward, but outward, tracing the shape of the life that had once carried them, and still might, in ways unseen. The porch began to feel different, not haunted, not sacred, just occupied in a new way, as though the presence of the shoes had changed the atmosphere, made it gentler, more attentive. Even the creak of the wooden planks beneath her chair began to fall into a pattern, a kind of rhythm that accompanied the slow afternoons. She found herself glancing at the shoes without meaning to, as though waiting for something wordless to arrive. They never moved in front of her. That much remained true. But sometimes she sensed they had completed something in her absence. Some gesture, some shift, before returning to stillness, polite but unapologetic. The wind brought leaves to rest near them, but the shoes remained untouched. No debris clung to the soles, no twig caught in their laces. It was as if the world had agreed to step around them. She began to wonder if that was why they had never been lost, because even time knew not to interrupt them. They were part of a path no longer visible but still active, like veins under old skin, carrying something remembered even when no one asked to. One morning she caught herself whispering good morning to them, just a breath of a greeting, softer than a breeze. She didn't feel embarrassed. It didn't feel strange. The shoes had become part of her rituals, not decoration, not burden, but presence. They marked the edge of her days, the way footsteps mark the edge of shorelines before the tide returns. She didn't wait for them to answer. She never expected they would, but somehow their silence was always in response. She noticed then the way sunlight landed on them. It was always the same. Whether overcast or clear, morning or late afternoon, the light found them gently. She began to wonder if that was part of why they had chosen this new place, because the porch gave them not just space, but a kind of light they remembered, or needed, or both. It made her feel like she was watching a plant lean toward a window, not out of choice, but instinct. And she no longer questioned how inanimate things could hold instinct. Some truths don't need explaining, only witnessing. She stopped placing the shoes herself. One day, she simply didn't touch them after sweeping. Left the broom leaning against the wall, the dustpan forgotten near the step, and when she returned, they had settled again, perfectly aligned, just beside where they had been. Close enough to know they remembered the old spot, but knew enough to suggest something had changed. It wasn't dramatic. It never was. Just enough. Just that. And it was always enough. The neighbors began to notice. Not the shoes themselves. No one ever asked about them directly, but the way she seemed to spend more time outside, seated near the railing, her gaze drifting somewhere just beyond the horizon. They would wave, offer polite greetings, sometimes comment on the weather. She always responded, warm but brief, as if she were in the middle of a conversation no one else could hear. No one asked what she was doing, and she never explained. There are some moments that unravel, if named. One afternoon, the mailman lingered longer than usual, his eyes catching the curve of the leather by her feet. "Old pair," he said, more to himself than to her. She nodded, said nothing. He didn't press further. And as he left, she felt a quiet relief, thankful that he hadn't asked the question she wouldn't have known how to answer. Not because it was a secret, but because the truth had grown too soft for words, like smoke, or dust, or breath on glass. She began to feel a difference in how the shoes made her feel. In the early weeks, their presence had tugged at something raw, a thin ache beneath every glance, but now they brought a steadiness, not joy, not yet, but balance, like standing on a dock and finding it holds, even with the water shifting beneath. She didn't lean on them, but they were there, always, the way gravity is there, the way memory becomes structure when nothing else makes sense. One day, she brought out a pair of socks, his, worn, folded neatly, still bearing the faint imprint of feet no longer there. She placed them beside the shoes without ceremony. It felt natural, like setting down cutlery at a table for one, but placing two sets anyway. The socks didn't move. She didn't expect them to, but the shoes shifted subtly over the next few days, closer to the bundle, as if acknowledging, as if recognizing something once held within them and welcoming it back. She didn't tell anyone. Not the neighbors, not the friend who called once a week, not the daughter who sent flowers from cities too far away. This wasn't grief she could articulate. It wasn't even grief anymore, not in the sharp, immediate sense. It was something else. Continuance. Presence without proof. A form of love that required no response, only space. And every morning, she gave it. A nod, a glance, a quiet clearing of her throat. And the shoes remained. Still not still. Still not gone. As the days softened into a kind of unnamed season, no longer summer, not yet autumn, she found herself waking earlier, often just before the light reached the horizon. The house was always quiet then, the kind of quiet that felt earned, not empty. She would make tea, wrap herself in the cardigan he used to wear on cool mornings, and step out onto the porch where the shoes waited, as they always did. Nothing ever dramatic. No new placement, no sudden signs, just their presence steady as breath. She began to understand they were not here to surprise her. They were here to stay with her. And maybe that was the surprise. One morning, the socks were gone. Not missing, just no longer there. She checked beneath the bench, under the mat, even inside the folds of the blanket she'd left out overnight. But they had disappeared as quietly as they had arrived. Her first instinct was to grieve them, irrational as that felt. But the shoes remained where they were, unbothered, unchanged. That, somehow, was comfort enough. It occurred to her that maybe the socks had served their purpose. Maybe they had completed something the shoes couldn't do alone, not by walking, just by being close, just by remembering what it was like to belong. She didn't replace them. She didn't bring out new ones or fold anything in their place. She simply allowed the space beside the shoes to remain empty. An invitation with no pressure. A seat at a table where the guest has already left, but the chair is not removed. And the shoes, in their quiet way, seemed to understand. They leaned ever so slightly toward that space now, not in longing, but in acknowledgement. She started placing small things nearby without planning to. A pine cone from the back garden, a feather caught in the screen door. Once, a page torn from an old book, words faded but edges soft from years of being held. These were not offerings. They were echoes. She would place them, forget about them, and days later they would be gone, carried by wind perhaps, or gathered by time. And the shoes never moved toward or away from them. They simply let them pass through, as if hosting something transient and kind. The porch became something more than a space. It was no longer just an exit or an edge. It became a kind of chapel, not of belief, but of rhythm, where things came and went not for explanation, but for rest, and she, in turn, had stopped expecting answers. There were no revelations, no messages scratched into wood, just a feeling that what once was lost was now not searching, but arriving. One pause at a time, one placement, one breath. Then, one day the shoes didn't return. She noticed it immediately, not with panic, but with a silence that rang louder than sound. The porch was bare except for the blanket she had folded the night before, still resting on the bench, untouched. The shoes were simply gone, not misplaced, not stolen. Gone in the way breath leaves a window pane, in the way a melody ends but still lingers behind the ears. She stood there for a long time, her hand resting on the doorframe, her body not quite leaning, not quite still. There was no wind, no trace, just the echo of where they had been. She didn't search. She didn't call anyone or check the yard. Instead, she walked back inside, slower than usual, and sat in the kitchen where the early light turned everything pale gold. Her tea cooled. The clock ticked in the corner, and in the stillness, she understood. Something had ended. But not in the way things usually end. Not with absence or finality. It felt more like punctuation, a period placed gently at the end of a sentence long delayed. The shoes had gone where they needed to go, and they had done so without needing to be seen. That evening, she stepped outside again, half expecting them to have returned. But the porch was empty, and it no longer felt strange. The space where they had rested still held their shape, like the indentation on a well-worn cushion. She did not place anything in their place. She did not try to fill the gap. Some spaces, she had come to learn, are meant to remain unoccupied, not as reminders of loss, but as proof that something once belonged. She sat for a while and watched the light shift across the planks. A cat passed through the yard without stopping. The trees whispered something in a language she didn't need to translate. Everything was as it had always been, and yet not. Something had lifted. Not weight, exactly, but distance. Like the part of her that had waited had now caught up. She no longer needed to follow. She had arrived. Quietly. Completely. Before going inside, she reached down and brushed the edge of the porch where the shoes used to rest. Her fingers gathered no dust. The wood was smooth, warmed by the day. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She only nodded, toward nothing and everything. And then she turned back into the house, closing the door behind her as if sealing a story that didn't need retelling. Not because it was forgotten, but because it had finally, softly, finished walking. After the shoes disappeared, the porch remained the same, but she did not. It wasn't obvious. The chair still sat in its usual place. The broom leaned as before, and the afternoon light continued to fall across the boards in long golden rectangles. But something had shifted in how she occupied the space. Her hands no longer fidgeted, her eyes no longer searched. She still came out every morning, still wrapped herself in the cardigan with frayed sleeves, still brought the tea she barely finished. But now she sat without expectation, without listening for something unspoken. Her stillness was no longer waiting. It had become arrival. There was an imprint left behind, not physical, not something one could photograph, but an outline that lived in the atmosphere, a shape of presence, like the way a room holds warmth even after the fire goes out. She could feel it when she stepped outside. The air remembered them too. It wasn't grief. Grief had a weight, a texture, a pulse. This was lighter, not joy, not absence. Something like continuation, like the page after the ending left blank on purpose. She didn't try to fill the space. She didn't bring new shoes or replace them with flowers. That would have felt loud, disruptive. Instead, she let the empty spot breathe. Some days, she found herself brushing the porch gently with her palm, fingers tracing invisible lines where souls once rested. She never did it deliberately. It was more like instinct, like checking for something she no longer needed to hold, but wasn't ready to forget. The wood beneath her touch always felt slightly warmer than expected. One morning she noticed something odd, a faint trail of dried mud along the edge of the porch, barely visible unless the sun struck it just so. It curved slightly, not quite straight, and ended near the place where the shoes had last been. It could have been from the gardener, she reasoned, or maybe a neighbor's dog. But a part of her knew it wasn't. The curve was too familiar. The arc of it mirrored a path they used to take around the garden years ago, his stride always a little wider, hers quickening to match. She didn't follow it, not yet, but she didn't brush it away either. She let the trail sit, quiet and untouched, like a question she no longer feared asking. Inside, the house began to feel less like a shelter and more like a vessel. Each room echoed differently now, not louder, just clearer, as if all the sounds that once hid behind furniture and under rugs had stepped forward, no longer needing to whisper. The hallway no longer felt long, the kitchen clock no longer ticked alone, and her footsteps, once timid and careful, had begun to find rhythm again, not borrowed, not imitated, but gently, unmistakably, her own. The garden began to draw her in, not for its flowers, they had long since given up trying to bloom with precision, but for the soil, the quiet, the way light filtered through the uneven canopy like hesitant forgiveness. She hadn't tended it properly in years, just the occasional trimming to keep the weeds from overtaking the path. But now she walked the garden slowly each day, tracing the stepping stones they once laid together, her feet adjusting to the rhythm of ground that remembered being walked upon. It was on the third morning that she noticed a small indentation near the edge of the rosemary bush. Nothing significant, just a shallow press in the soil, as if something light had rested there briefly. A heel, maybe, or the round base of a shoe toe. She crouched, examined it without touching. The earth around it was dry, undisturbed. No trail leading to or from it. Just that one mark, quiet and alone. She smiled, not in certainty, but in recognition. Not of the shape itself, but of the gesture. Some presences don't need repetition to be believed. From that point on, she stopped expecting signs. And that was precisely when they began to appear. Not often, not clearly, but in ways she didn't question. A leaf curled into the exact spiral of an old shoelace. A line of pine needles along the path forming a nearly perfect left-right-left. Once, the scent of worn leather on the wind, carried faintly for just a second before vanishing into the hum of bees. These were not messages, not memories either. They were echoes of movement, gentle confirmations that something once passed through and still might, in its own way. She never told anyone, not out of secrecy, but out of understanding. These things weren't meant to be shared. They were meant to be kept, held lightly in the palms of quiet mornings. She wrote less in her notebook now. The pages remained open, waiting, but she found fewer words. What had once felt like a map had become more of a mirror. She no longer needed to track the direction. She had become part of the path. The mud trail on the porch faded eventually. Rain softened its edges, and sun bleached what remained. She let it disappear without mourning. Its job was never permanence. It was presence, and presence had done what it came to do. Still, on some days, she imagined it remained, just hidden beneath a sheen of memory and dust, ready to reveal itself should anyone ever return the same way. Her feet, now bare more often than not, grew familiar with the coolness of tile, the roughness of bark, the give of soil. She began to notice how she stepped, not where, but how. She moved without hesitation, but never in a rush. Her gait was her own now. But it carried something else with it, too. A cadence inherited not by blood, but by time spent beside something that knew the value of every step taken, and everyone left unfinished. She began to walk in circles. Not the frantic kind, not loops of restlessness or confusion, but quiet orbits, around the garden, along the porch, sometimes within the narrow hall between bedroom and stairs. The shape didn't matter. What mattered was the repetition, the rhythm, the way her body started to remember something the mind had long stopped naming. She did not set out to do this. It happened the way breath happens, naturally, without instruction. And in these quiet circuits, she felt less like she was searching for something lost, and more like she was keeping something alive by continuing the motion. One afternoon, as she rounded the rosemary bush for the third time, she paused, not because she was tired, but because her shadow was wrong. It wasn't behind her. It wasn't beside her. It was ahead, stretching slightly forward, as though leading her. The sun was low, yes. The angle explained it. But there was something about the shape that didn't look entirely hers. The shoulders were narrower. The head tilted slightly differently. And for a brief second, she didn't step forward. She followed. Not because she thought the shadow would move on its own, but because she wanted to honor the possibility. Later that evening, she stood before the closet where his coat still hung. She hadn't opened it in months, maybe longer. The fabric had gone stiff along the shoulders. The sleeves still bent slightly at the elbow, frozen in the shape of arms that had once known how to rest. She didn't touch it, didn't breathe in the scent. She only stood in its presence for a while, remembering not the man, not the moments, but the movement. How he used to rise slowly from chairs, plant his heel before his toe when walking downhill, pause just before unlocking a door. These were not memories she could recite. They lived in her now, not as thoughts, but as steps. The house began to shift again, not physically, but in tone. The rooms started to feel taller, the ceilings farther away. Not because she felt small, but because she had begun to notice space differently. Each corner carried weight. Each doorway framed not just passage, but pause. She walked more slowly now, not from age or fatigue, but out of reverence, for the floors, for the past, for the shoes that had shown her what it meant to walk, without having to arrive. Outside, the porch remained empty. And yet some mornings, she would still step around the spot where the shoes once sat, out of habit perhaps, or courtesy, as if she had internalized the choreography of grief so thoroughly that even in absence, she chose not to intrude. And maybe that, too, was love. Not the kind spoken or even held, but the kind lived quietly in the way someone steps aside, so something that is no longer there can still have room to be. It was around this time that she began to hum, softly, without tune, not songs, not melodies, just threads of sound that curled out of her breath like mist. She didn't notice it at first. It began as a murmur while watering the plants, a hum while setting the kettle, a whisper in her throat while folding linens. But soon, the house caught on. The walls seemed to carry the sound gently, holding it without echo, as though grateful for something newly alive. She never hummed when he was alive. He was the one who filled rooms with sound. Half-remembered jazz, footsteps that landed with rhythm, absent-minded whistles while reading the paper. She had always been quieter. Now, her quiet was filled with motion, with low vibrations that didn't ask to be heard but simply wished to exist. And that somehow was the greatest shift of all. Not that she had changed, but that silence had become something she could move through, rather than hide inside. One morning, she caught herself humming as she opened the front door and paused. The sound slipped past her into the air, spilling onto the porch like water from a cup. It landed gently where the shoes had once rested, and for a brief moment, she felt as if the space received it, not with reply, not with sign, only with permission. She didn't know what that meant exactly, but she didn't need to. Some exchanges didn't require comprehension, only participation. The garden responded in kind. Flowers that had once bloomed unevenly began opening in small clusters, not full, not proud, but present. The rosemary bush she once thought dead began pushing new green from beneath its bark. Even the stubborn ivy, long resigned to clinging lazily to the fence, seemed to stretch a bit farther each day, as if following something unseen. She didn't claim credit. Nature moved on its own time. But she did wonder if grief, when made gentle, could nourish more than just memory. Inside, she began moving furniture, not drastically, but enough. A chair turned slightly toward the window. A rug shifted closer to the bookshelves. a lamp placed where its light touched a forgotten photograph. It wasn't redecorating. It was realignment. Not to erase the past, but to let the present breathe. She found herself walking new paths within the same rooms, her feet finding roots that curved, paused, wandered, like the shoes once did, like she now did too. That night she sat by the open door and let the hum return, not from her throat, but from the floor, the air, the walls. She realized it had never really left. It had just been waiting for her to join. And in that layered hush, where nothing moved and yet everything listened, she finally understood. It was never about the shoes. It was always about the walking. The seasons began to turn without announcement. The mornings came cooler, the afternoons shorter, and the air held a crispness that tasted faintly of memory. She pulled the sleeves of her cardigan lower, not out of cold, but comfort. The edges of leaves began to curl at their tips, amber and rust finding their way through the greens like old stories retold in gentler tones. And though she marked no calendar, she knew time had passed, not because it moved quickly, but because it no longer asked for her permission. She brought a cushion out to the porch, not for herself, but for the step. It was an old one, floral print faded, the kind once placed on wooden benches long since retired. She set it gently where the shoes had once rested, not as replacement, but as acknowledgement. The space had carried them long enough. Now it could rest too. She didn't sit on it. She didn't touch it after. But each morning, she nodded toward it like greeting an old friend whose presence needed no words. The birds returned in quieter flocks. Not the frenzied spirals of early spring, but the measured glides of creatures who had flown these skies many times before. She watched them with the patience of someone who no longer needed spectacle to feel wonder. Their wings cut paths through air she had once filled with waiting. Now, they simply moved. And she, in her own way, moved with them. Inside, she found a drawer filled with things she had forgotten, a bus ticket tucked into an envelope, a pair of reading glasses she no longer needed, a pebble with a faint scratch across its middle. She wasn't sure if it was the same one from the shoe, but she let her fingers close around it just the same. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She only placed it in the bowl by the windowsill, where light landed every afternoon without fail. Some objects aren't meant to be kept or thrown away. Only seen. Only held. She started walking the block again. Not daily. Just often enough. Her steps were slow but sure, the sound of soles on pavement no longer echoing with absence. She didn't look at the shoes of others. She didn't need to. The memory of movement lived not in what she saw, but in what she carried. And with every step she felt something more than grief, something quieter than healing. A rhythm, a remembering. Not of what was lost, but of what continued. And when she returned home, always at the same time, just before the sky turned gold, she would pause at the threshold, not to check, not to hope, but to feel, for the soft impression of something that had once walked beside her, and might still, just beyond the edge of her knowing. That evening, the wind carried the scent of rain before a single drop had fallen. It was the kind of air that felt heavier without being harsh, full of possibility and pause. She stood by the doorway longer than usual, one hand resting on the frame, the other still damp from washing the last teacup. The house behind her glowed in soft amber, lamplight on wallpaper, shadows stretching gently across familiar walls. She did not step outside. She only looked, as though waiting not for someone, but for something to settle. The cushion on the porch had shifted slightly. Just a corner, barely enough to notice. But she noticed. And like every other time, she did not touch it. She let the movement remain. It was not a sign, not a message, not a haunting. It was simply proof that stillness was never absolute, that even the most silent things adjusted themselves to the rhythms of unseen memory. The porch breathed around her. So did the threshold. So did she. That night, she dreamt not of shoes or footsteps, not of shadows or roads, She dreamt of a path made entirely of pauses, stones that held warmth without ever being touched, trees that bent slightly as if bowing in quiet recognition. In the dream, she did not walk. She sat on a bench that had no legs, only presence. Across from her, an empty space. Not cold, not waiting. Just there. And she understood without words that something had arrived long ago and simply chose not to leave, not out of duty, but out of grace. When she awoke, there was nothing different in the room. No trace of the dream. No signs. And yet her breathing felt deeper, her spine longer, her hands less like tools and more like extensions of thought. She moved through the morning gently, watered the plant on the windowsill, folded the blanket on the chair, opened the door, not for air, but for invitation. The porch met her the way it always had, empty, quiet, deeply known. She stepped onto it without hesitation. For the first time in weeks, she sat on the cushion. The fabric was cool beneath her, worn but soft, like a memory willing to be held without explanation. Her hands rested on her knees, her eyes closed, and for a moment that stretched beyond measure, she didn't think of anything at all. Not of him, not of the shoes, not of where they had gone or whether they would return. She simply sat, part of the porch, part of the story, part of the space where walking had once happened, and might again, someday in some form. And when she finally rose, slowly, with grace, she left the cushion behind. She did not straighten it. She did not brush it smooth. She let it remain slightly askew, a quiet echo of all the things that had once refused to stay still, and in doing so, had taught her how to. The invitation to leave came not as a thought, but as a rhythm, barely felt, never voiced. It moved beneath her skin like a current long buried under frost, waiting for the first thaw. She had no destination in mind, no itinerary, no errands to tether the motion, only the sense that her feet were ready, that staying too long might now be the only thing keeping her from arriving somewhere she hadn't yet imagined. She chose the road behind the house, the one overgrown with vines and bordered by stone fences that remembered more footsteps than faces. It wasn't a path she used often, but it had always been there, quiet and patient. The kind of road that asked nothing of you, just your presence, just your trust in its unfolding. She didn't bring a bag, didn't bring a phone, only a scarf, a notebook, and her body, still steady, still hers. The sky above was soft, an early gray that suggested neither rain nor certainty. The trees leaned inward along the trail, forming arches not grand enough to impress, but intimate enough to comfort. Her steps landed lightly at first, cautious, almost ceremonial, as though the road might break beneath her or protest her passage. But it held. The ground met her with a memory of firmness, the kind that remembered how to carry weight without question. Birdsong followed her like a trailing thought, not loud, not melodic, just enough to remind her that she was not alone, even here, even now. Every so often she passed a branch that had fallen or a stone that tilted from age, and she found herself stepping just around them rather than over, as if not to disturb the way they had chosen to rest. It was a small kindness, the kind she had once offered unconsciously to others, and now returned to the world itself. The farther she walked, the more she noticed how her body remembered this motion, not in muscle, but in meaning. Her shoulders loosened, her breath deepened, and the space between thoughts stretched wider, softer. She no longer reviewed the past as she walked. She no longer waited for signs. This was not about the shoes anymore. This was about what remained after the shoes had finished their task. The silence that now walked with her did not trail behind. It moved alongside, not as absence, as witness. And somewhere between one curve and the next, she began to feel that maybe the road had always known she would come, that every step she had resisted taking before had not been wrong, only premature. The journey was never waiting for her readiness. It had only been waiting for her stillness to turn into motion, and now, with each footfall pressed gently into earth, she was not leaving something behind. She was stepping into what had always been walking toward her. She did not count her steps, but she remembered their rhythm. Left, right, Pause. A small lean forward. A breath that synchronized not with exertion, but with presence. The road offered no milestones, no markers of distance or achievement. It simply unfolded, bend after bend, like a sentence written in the grammar of trees and light. There were no choices to make, no forks, no signage, just the soft insistence of continuation. At one point, she passed an old fence post broken in half, its wood pale and soft from decades of rain. Moss covered its base like quiet forgiveness. She rested her hand there, not for balance, but acknowledgement. It had once stood tall. Now it tilted inward, closer to the earth, closer to return. She did not fix it. She did not move on quickly. She let her fingers rest a moment longer than needed, then resumed walking, her own spine straighter in reply. A little farther on, a small clearing opened unexpectedly, not wide, not dramatic, just a pocket of sky allowed to reach the ground. She stepped into it as if crossing a threshold and stood still in its center. There was nothing there. No monument, no bench, just grass flattened by wind and a stillness that matched her own. She sat on the earth without hesitation, crossed her legs, closed her eyes, not to meditate, not to remember, just to let the world be around her without needing her to witness it. The breeze shifted. A few dry leaves stirred, brushing against her knee. Somewhere overhead, a branch creaked, not from strain, but from settling. She imagined the shoes for the first time in hours, not as objects, not as memories, but as direction. They had never wanted her to stay still. They had not walked away to be followed. They had walked ahead so she could know how to begin. That was their gift. Not presence, but permission. She opened her notebook for the first time that day. Its pages fluttered slightly in the breeze before settling open to a blank one. No lines, no ink, just space. She didn't write immediately. Her pen hovered, then lowered. One word came, then another. Not a sentence. Not a story. Just fragments. Small declarations of arrival. The kind of thoughts that didn't explain but affirmed. Like nods. Like footsteps. Like silence that had learned how to speak without sound. She closed the book gently. Not out of conclusion, but agreement. The road was still waiting, and though she did not know how far it would go or where it would bend next, she understood now that walking it wasn't about reaching. It was about continuing. And with that, she stood, not slowly, not urgently, and resumed her pace. Left, right, a pause, a breath, as though something within her had been unlocked, not by force, but by quiet invitation. The path narrowed for a time, hemmed in by overgrown shrubs and branches that arched low as if bowing to memory. She didn't mind. There was something comforting in the closeness, the way the world seemed to draw near without pressing in. Each leaf she brushed aside felt like a quiet acknowledgement, as though the landscape remembered her, not by name, but by shape, by pace, by the way she carried silence like a familiar coat. She stepped carefully over roots that rose like reminders, choosing each footing without hurry. In doing so, she noticed how her balance had returned, not just in body, but in thought. The inner leaning that once pulled her backward into memories now steadied her forward, like invisible hands adjusting posture in response to trust. She felt no fear of falling, not because she believed she couldn't, but because she knew now that falling wasn't the same as failing. Sometimes it was just another way of listening to the ground. At a curve just past the bend, the trees opened again. This time, a wooden bench waited beneath an aging oak. Its surface was worn smooth in the center, flanked by rough edges where hands might have rested too long. She approached it like one approaches a familiar story, aware of the ending, yet still moved by the return. She didn't sit immediately. She stood before it, letting her shadow fall across the slats, and for a moment she imagined a pair of shoes placed there. Not hers, not his, just present, holding space. When she finally sat, the bench greeted her without sound. Its wood held warmth from the earlier sun, and a fine layer of pollen dusted the far corner like powdered gold. She did not brush it away. She only breathed in, letting the moment press gently into her bones. There was no revelation, no vision, no sudden change in air, only a stillness that felt shared, as though the bench, the tree, and the sky above had all chosen this moment together and invited her into it. She removed her shoes not because her feet ached, but because she wanted the ground to know her again. The soil beneath her soles was cool, slightly damp, textured with leaves and small twigs. It welcomed her without question. She flexed her toes once, then let them settle, and for a while she sat barefoot and wordless, her breath matching the slow pulse of a world that had long since stopped asking for anything more than presence. Far in the distance, a crow called out, not urgently, but with clarity. She didn't turn her head. Some sounds didn't require response. They only marked place, like mileposts on a journey that was both deeply personal and utterly shared, and as the wind lifted gently through the trees, she leaned back just slightly and let herself be exactly where she was, neither waiting nor remembering. Just walking still, even while at rest. She remained on the bench long enough for the shadows to shift across her feet. The light that once filtered through the canopy now pooled at angles, catching in the creases of bark and the threads of her scarf. Time was moving, but not measuring. There were no clocks here, no bells or appointments, just the subtle signaling of day leaning toward evening. And for the first time in a long time, she felt no pull to return. Not because she had left something behind, but because she had brought it all with her. A single acorn dropped nearby, quiet as a thought. It rolled a short distance, came to rest against her heel. She looked down, smiled without reason, and left it there. Some moments didn't ask to be interpreted. They only asked to be noticed. That, she had learned, was the difference between remembrance and longing. One holds, the other pulls, and she no longer needed to be pulled. She had arrived, not at a destination, but at a way of being. Her hands found the notebook again, fingers smudged faintly with dust and bark. She opened to a fresh page and traced a single line, not with ink, but with her fingertip. An invisible gesture, more movement than mark. She had filled many pages over the months, but none carried the weight of this one. It didn't need words. It only needed to exist. A page opened, a body still, a breath held long enough for the world to imprint upon it. She stood slowly, not out of reluctance, but out of respect. The bench had held her kindly, and she nodded in quiet thanks before placing her shoes beside it. Not discarded, not forgotten, just left, facing forward, close enough to each other to feel accompanied, far enough apart to suggest intention. A position she knew well. The shoes had taught her that, how to remain, how to lean, how to begin again without rushing. She stepped away barefoot, her soles warmed by the sun-struck path ahead. The trail narrowed once more, this time leading into a low dip between hills. Grass grew higher here, brushing against her ankles, leaving soft traces of passage. She didn't rush through. Her pace was even, quiet, reverent. She was no longer walking to remember. She was walking as remembrance itself. With each step, she felt less like a figure on a journey and more like part of the landscape, a shape in motion, a presence shaped by motion. Somewhere in that long, low stretch of earth and green, she began to hum again. Not because she needed to, not because she thought someone might hear, but because the rhythm asked for it. The path beneath her feet, the air against her arms, the trees breathing above, all seemed to invite sound, and so she gave it, gently, a single note that never quite became a melody, a thread of voice winding through the late afternoon like a promise already fulfilled. The land began to rise gently beneath her, a long slope covered in patches of moss and dry grass, where the trail grew thinner but never disappeared. It didn't feel like a climb. It felt like being lifted, not by effort, but by something already carrying her. With each step, the air grew quieter, not in absence of sound, but in refinement. Every breeze, every rustle of grass, every soft thud of her heel against earth became part of a music too delicate for memory to hold. She moved through it like a thought passing through a dream that didn't need to be remembered, only lived once, wholly. At the top of the hill, the world widened. No fence, no signpost, no conclusion, just space. A great field of open ground, golden in the lowering light, where distance no longer asked to be measured. She stood still, not out of awe, but recognition. She had never been here before, and yet everything felt familiar, not in detail, but in invitation. This was not a place that asked questions. It was a place that received answers, without words. She walked into the field with bare feet and a steady breath, her steps bending the grasses just slightly, leaving no trace that would last beyond the hour. She didn't need a path now. The road had lived long enough inside her that direction was no longer something external. She followed nothing. She led nothing. She simply moved, a figure dissolving into the evening with no need to distinguish herself from the land that held her. At the center of the field stood a tree, tall, quiet, imperfect, its branches crooked toward the sun like tired arms, still trying to embrace what light remained. She approached it without intention, without plan, just a pull as natural as shadow to flame. Beneath its canopy, she found a patch of ground worn smooth by wind. No footprints, no offerings, just space. She lowered herself there, folding her legs, letting her hands rest lightly on her knees. The tree made no sound, but its leaves swayed with the kind of rhythm she had come to understand. Not regular, not random, but real. A rhythm shaped by patience. She leaned back slightly against its trunk, and for the first time since the shoes had gone, she felt the same kind of stillness they once carried, a presence that wasn't there to guide or remind, but to accompany. No more lessons, no more signals, just a shared breath between two things that had both stood long enough to know they didn't need to move to be walking. The sun touched the rim of the world then, setting without drama. She did not rise to watch it go. She simply closed her eyes, and in the hum that lived behind them, she felt every step she had ever taken gather gently into this one still moment, quiet, barefoot, unending. Night arrived not with suddenness, but with a softness that felt earned. The sky darkened in gradients, turning the field into a place without edges. Stars emerged one by one, not to illuminate, but to accompany. She remained beneath the tree, neither cold nor waiting, her back resting against the trunk, like a punctuation mark at the end of a long, gentle sentence. There was nothing left to do, and still, everything felt in motion. In the distance, an owl called once, then fell silent. She opened her eyes briefly, not to look, but to acknowledge. The dark did not obscure, it clarified. Without color or contrast, the world lost its distractions. What remained was shape, shadow, outline. And in that quiet reduction, she felt more visible than ever, like her presence no longer needed form to be known. She was not a woman under a tree. She was part of the night, part of the breath that passed through it, a step that had never really ended. Her fingers brushed the ground beside her and found a small indentation, a dip in the earth no larger than a heel. It might have been natural, a mark left by wind or rain, or perhaps not. She didn't decide. She only laid her palm over it, the way one might greet an old friend without needing to speak their name. The earth was warm there, or maybe her hand was. It didn't matter. What mattered was the stillness between them, shared, undemanding. She did not sleep beneath the tree, but she rested longer than she meant to. When she finally stood, the field greeted her without resistance. Her legs did not ache. Her feet did not complain. She slipped her shoes back on. Not the old ones, not his, but her own. They were light, well-worn, quiet. They did not need to remember the path. They only needed to carry her through it. And as she turned toward the direction from which she had come, she realized something unexpected. There was no return. Not because the trail had vanished, or the landmarks changed, but because return was no longer the shape her life followed. She would walk again, yes. She would step back into rooms she had left, fold blankets she had once set aside, sip tea in familiar mugs. But she would not be returning. She would be arriving again, each time, each place, as someone slightly altered by the distance between footsteps, by the silence between questions. And so she began to walk once more, not toward home, not away from it, but along the thread of path that had unfolded quietly since the first day the shoes had shifted. Her own stride now, her own shadow, but never alone. The road had never been about where he had gone. It had always been about who she became by continuing. The house did not greet her with surprise. When she opened the door, there was no creak that hadn't been heard before, no shift in air that felt like return. Everything was as it had been, quiet, familiar, still. But she was not the same. She moved through each room not like someone returning to a place left behind, but like someone arriving for the first time without needing to knock. Her presence fit, not because the space had waited, but because she no longer asked it to explain itself. In the kitchen, the spoon lay where she had left it. The window's light fell across the counter in the exact shape it always had. And yet, her hand reached differently now, more gently, more slowly, as though the cup she lifted had memory woven into its curve. She poured water into the kettle and watched the spiral of steam begin to rise, not with anticipation, but with witness. The act of making tea had not changed, but it no longer filled silence. It extended it. She did not look for the shoes, not on the porch, not in the closet, not in memory. They had done what they were meant to do, whatever that had been. She still didn't name it. She didn't need to. Some things are completed not with understanding, but with movement. Their absence did not echo now. It folded softly into the corners of her day, like the memory of warmth long after the sun has set. She didn't speak to them anymore, but she still listened in the same way. The notebook remained where she had left it, on the table near the window. She opened it, not to write, but to touch. Her fingers skimmed the filled pages, then paused at the most recent blank one. She didn't add to it. She simply rested her hand there, a gesture of continuation rather than addition. The story had not ended, but it no longer needed to be told with ink. Her steps, her breath, the shape of her quiet days, all of it had become its own kind of writing. That afternoon, she walked the garden without counting time. The rosemary had bloomed more fully than expected. A small sprig had split into two, reaching in opposite directions like a choice she never had to make. The breeze was light, just enough to lift her scarf and remind her how air could carry things not meant to be held. She followed the familiar path, not because it led somewhere new, but because it allowed her to walk without arriving. And that, she had learned, was the true destination. At the porch step, she sat, not to rest, just to sit. Her feet touched the wood softly, her palms on either side of her, anchoring without effort. She watched a single leaf twist its way to the ground, landing gently beside her heel. Not behind, not ahead, beside. And in that quiet companionship, she felt it again. Not the shoes, not the man, not the past, but the echo of a presence that now walked where she did, because she had finally made space for it to stay. The next morning unfolded without expectation. She didn't wake early nor late, just at the time her body chose, without prompt or alarm. The air in the bedroom was cool, the blanket slightly twisted at her feet, a gentle mess that made the bed feel lived in rather than abandoned. She sat up slowly, not from stiffness, but from intention. Each movement had become something more than habit now. It was a conversation, between presence and place, between what was done and what remained. She lingered at the window longer than usual. The glass held the faint imprint of her breath before fading into clarity. Outside, the tree in the yard stood the way it always had, crooked, unbothered, honest. She thought of the bench beneath it, the shoes she had once placed there, and how the tree never asked for explanation. It had witnessed without judgment. That was the kind of presence she hoped to carry now. Not imposing, not fragile, just real. Downstairs, the morning routine returned like a tide, gentle, familiar, without fanfare. She fed the cat, opened the curtains, ran her fingers across the bookshelf not to choose something to read, but to remember the texture of spines long held. The kettle sang its single-note melody, and she answered not with urgency, but a small smile. In every sound, in every object, something echoed. Not him, not absence, but the rhythm of how life continues when nothing demands it to. She carried her tea to the porch. The cushion she had once placed for the shoes still rested on the step, slightly faded now, gently bowed in the center. She didn't move it, didn't sit on it. It wasn't for that. It was a space, a kept promise, a reminder not of grief, but of grace. She sat beside it, her own cushion worn at the edges from months of quiet return. And together, her, the porch, the untouched place, they welcomed the day without speaking. A breeze passed through, light enough to stir the ends of her scarf. She closed her eyes and let it wrap around her for just a moment. It smelled faintly of pine and distant rain, but more than that, it felt like motion. Not hers, not the wind's, but something older. The kind of motion that lives in waiting things, in the shoes that once moved when no one watched, in the pages of her notebook that fluttered before being opened, in the heart that beats, not because it must, but because it chooses to, again and again. She didn't write that day. She didn't need to. There are days for writing and days for living what will never need to be written. And this morning, this breath, this stillness beside a space once occupied, was not a sentence. It was a presence. And she was no longer the observer. She was part of the line. She began moving through the house differently, not to rearrange, not to renovate, only to notice. The hallways she once hurried through became paths she now lingered in. The spaces between furniture, once seen only as necessary gaps, now felt like pauses in a sentence well constructed. She placed her hand on door frames as she passed, not for support, but for grounding, like touching stone in an old cathedral. These were not her habits before, but they had become her now. And with each day, the home responded, not by changing, but by revealing what had always been quietly waiting. In the corner of the living room, the old coat rack still stood, unused, slightly crooked, with one hook missing. It had once held his walking stick, then nothing, then silence. She stood before it one afternoon and considered removing it. But something in its leaning shape reminded her of people who stay in the room long after the conversation has ended, neither contributing nor interrupting, just being there out of kindness. She left it where it was, slightly dusted the edges, and whispered nothing. Later, she opened the drawer beneath the stairs. It was where forgotten things gathered, shoelaces with no partners, notes with no dates, gloves with no matches. She didn't rummage. She sifted. Her fingers passed over buttons, coins, a broken clasp. At the bottom, she found a small cloth pouch. Inside, 2 pebbles, smooth, dark, familiar. She did not try to remember where they came from. She simply closed her palm around them and sat with their weight for a while. They were not heavy, but they were present, and sometimes that was more important. She placed them on the windowsill beside her chair, not for display, for inclusion. They belonged here now, just as much as the light that fell across them each afternoon. She didn't try to explain them to herself. There was no need. Like the shoes, like the steps, like the way her body now moved through space. Some things arrived to stay without asking to be known. Even the clock, long considered a background sound, began to feel different. Its ticking no longer marked hours. It held rhythm, a kind of heartbeat shared between objects and motion. When it chimed, she didn't look up. She didn't count. She let it pass through her like a wind that chose not to lift anything, only touch and go. And in that fleeting vibration she sometimes imagined the outline of footsteps, not hers, not his, just footsteps that had no need to be followed anymore. She stood in the center of the living room as the light changed, her arms gently folded, her breath slow and steady. Nothing moved, and yet she felt surrounded by motion, not visible, not loud, but constant. The movement of presence, of memory that didn't ache, of spaces that no longer asked for filling, only walking, only being, only remaining. The staircase had always been practical. 7 steps up to the landing, then 5 more to the bedrooms. She had walked them thousands of times, carrying laundry, cups of tea, thoughts too heavy to name. But lately she began to pause on the landing, not for rest, but for rhythm. There was a particular quality to that spot, halfway between above and below, where the light from the upstairs window met the shadows from below. It was neither arrival nor departure. It was in between. And something about that in-between had begun to feel like home. On one of those pauses, she turned to face the wall. There was a nail there, long abandoned, bent slightly downwards. It had once held a photograph. She couldn't recall which. Now it held nothing, but it hadn't fallen. She touched it gently, surprised by how firm it remained. A presence without purpose, perhaps. Or perhaps a purpose that had outlived visibility. She left it, a quiet sentinel on the landing, unnoticed by most, essential only to her. In the upstairs room that used to be his study, she opened the window. The air carried dust, scent of old paper, and something lighter, like sunlight trying to become wind. The desk remained, though it had not been used in months. Notebooks still stacked, pens still scattered, a mug with faded glaze holding pencils that had forgotten what it meant to draw. She didn't clean. She didn't organize. She only sat in the chair he once leaned back in, let her fingers run along the edge of the desk, and allowed the silence to settle as naturally as dust. From there she could see the yard, the path she had walked, the tree she had sat beneath, the bench she had left behind, all visible, all quiet. She watched as a breeze moved through the rosemary and paused at the porch, the cushion still there, unbothered. She imagined the shoes, not placed, not waiting, just remembered into being for one quiet second. And then she let the image fade, replaced by the softer truth. They didn't need to appear anymore. Their work was done. What remained now were the steps she made without them. Back downstairs she lit a candle, not for ritual, not for scent, just to mark the hour. Flame made time visible. And as it flickered on the edge of the countertop, she saw how light curved around the smallest objects, around the jar of honey, the handle of a spoon, the soft lip of the teacup. Everything was touched briefly, as if in quiet conversation. And that, too, she had learned to notice. Not the flame, but its reach. Not the shoe, but its echo. She did not miss them anymore. Not because she had forgotten, but because she had begun to carry them properly. Not as loss, as shape. And every time her foot touched the floor, she knew she wasn't walking alone. She began cooking again. Not out of necessity, but out of rhythm. The kitchen welcomed her movements like an old friend who had grown quiet with waiting. She didn't make elaborate meals. A pot of soup, bread toasted slowly, apples sliced thin, arranged in quiet spirals on a small white plate. The knife moved gently across the wooden board, each cut a soft punctuation. She hummed again, not a melody, but a breath given shape, and the room listened. She set the table for one, but always left space for two. Not with a second plate, not with silverware, just with space. The opposite chair remained pulled out slightly, as though someone had risen only moments before and might return at any time. She didn't look toward it. She didn't speak to it. But she sat with it, ate beside it, breathed in time with the silence it held. After each meal, she rinsed the dishes slowly, her hands moving through the warm water as though remembering another set of hands once there beside hers. She didn't close her eyes. She didn't drift into reverie. She stayed. Fully. The spoon became clean. The glass became clear. The towel held their dampness. Then let it go. She placed each item back with care, not out of precision, but as a gesture of belonging. Even the plates, she had learned, want to feel they still have a place. Outside, the weather had cooled. Mornings came with mist. Afternoons thinned into gold earlier than before. She began walking at dusk, her scarf tied loosely, her shoes moving over the uneven sidewalk with surety. She no longer glanced at the ground for signs. She no longer checked behind her. What once required confirmation now moved with her, within her. She wasn't retracing steps. She was writing new ones. Children played down the street, their laughter skipping ahead like startled birds. A neighbor nodded from a porch swing. Somewhere, music played faintly from a kitchen radio. She passed all of it like a breeze might pass a window, present, but not interrupting. She no longer felt the need to be seen, but she had stopped trying to disappear. Her presence had softened into something that didn't ask. It simply remained. One evening she paused beside a puddle from an earlier rain. The water held the sky perfectly. Clouds stretched long across its surface, a single leaf drifting lazily through their reflection. She looked down and saw her shape there, not sharply drawn, but whole. Not a ghost, not a shadow, just a woman standing, shoes grounded, arms still, breathing. She didn't step around it. She walked through. The water rose gently around her ankles, soaking the edges of her trousers. But she didn't flinch. She didn't hurry. She let the ripples pass out from her slowly, touching the stone edges and returning again. And in that mirrored moment, where sky met earth and motion met stillness, she realized the walk had never been about reaching a door or a tree or a bench. It had always been about this, feeling every part of her truly arrive. She began leaving the door open more often. Not wide, just ajar, enough for the air to come through and for the house to exhale without effort. The breeze carried nothing in particular. No messages, no memories, no perfume from seasons past. Just movement, just presence. And that was enough. She had learned that doors didn't need to lead anywhere to be meaningful. Sometimes they only needed to let something pass through. The cushion on the porch remained. A little flatter now, its seams stretched by months of quiet companionship. She still didn't sit on it. She didn't move it inside. But she brushed it gently once each week, the way one might straighten a blanket on a bed no longer used but never abandoned. There were no footprints beside it, no marks on the wood. But every now and then, in the right light, she thought she saw the faint suggestion of a pause, a hesitation, a trace not left, but remembered into being. In the evenings, she wrote again, not every night, and not always in the notebook. Sometimes on scraps of paper, sometimes on napkins, sometimes on nothing at all, just forming words in her mind and letting them drift out through the open door. They were never stories. Not anymore. They were reflections, small and round, like stones placed along a path not to guide, but to acknowledge. Each word was a step, each silence a rest. On the first night it snowed, she stood by the window in bare feet, watching as the white gathered on branches, fences, roofs. The world lost its edges, and yet nothing felt erased. The field, the porch, the shoes, the journey, they were still there, just softened, hushed, as though the entire landscape had agreed to speak a little more quietly, just for a while. She opened the window, let the cold kiss her skin, and whispered nothing into the white. Nothing needed to be said. She didn't dream much anymore, not because dreams had stopped, but because her waking hours had become gentle enough to contain them. She no longer chased meaning through symbols. She no longer sought return in signs. The shoes had taught her what footsteps couldn't. That movement doesn't always need direction. That memory, when loved gently enough, becomes presence. And presence, when trusted, never asks to be proved. The last page of her notebook remained blank. She never tried to fill it, not out of hesitation, out of understanding. Some stories don't need conclusions. They just need someone to carry their shape forward, quietly, into the ordinary days. She kept the notebook closed, resting near the window where the light would reach it most afternoons. Not because it needed warmth, but because it deserved to be touched by something still moving. And so she moved too. Through rooms, through light, through years, not waiting, not watching, just walking, not because something called her forward, or because something followed behind, but because there was a path now, made not of distance, but of presence. A path that would never truly end, because it had already arrived.